Like many people, I've always been curious about my ethnic identity. A couple of years ago, I took a swab of saliva from inside my cheek and then sent it off to a company that deciphers DNA. The results indicate that I'm the quintessential mixed-up American, just as my father always assured me I was whenever I asked where our ancestors had come from. With a wry smile, he would recount the list, telling me I was English, Irish, Scottish, French, German, and a little fox terrier. The results of my DNA test confirmed that most of my ancestors hailed from Western Europe, but I also discovered Scandinavian, Jewish, and even North African roots. Surprised by this, I began to wonder what it would be like to travel back in time in order to meet the people who populated my family tree. Unfortunately, I'm no Marty McFly of Back to the Future fame. There's no tricked-out car in my driveway that will propel me into the future, let alone transport me into the past. But there is another aspect of my ancestry, the spiritual part, that I can explore in some detail. The Bible speaks to me about both the present and the future, but it also reveals a great deal about the past and the people who populate its pages. Reading it offers the opportunity not only to learn about God, but to explore my spiritual DNA, allowing me to meet the people in my spiritual family tree. Before one word of the Bible was ever written down, its stories and instructions were spoken aloud. Certainly that must have been how many of the stories included in Scripture were first told and then retold, and then passed from generation to generation. Perhaps around a campfire under starry skies. When the sun went down and their work was done, people shared a meal and told stories about their nation and tribe, entertaining each other with memories of colorful characters and events, real people whom their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had known. Some unsavory stories, like the ones about Amnon or about Samson's wicked girlfriend Delilah, may have been reserved for later to be told only after the children went to bed. The stories remained remarkably accurate because of the way they were reported and remembered. From their earliest years, children would have considered the stories of people like Sarah, Jacob, and Judah as part of their family history. These characters were like elderly aunts and uncles who happened to be the first shoots on their family tree. Unlike other holy books, the Bible never whitewashes its characters. That's part of what makes it so believable. We sense that the people who populate its pages are real human beings with many of the same vulnerabilities and problems that trouble our world. If the Bible were merely a puff piece, surely several of these stories would never have made their way into its pages. Take the story of Gomer, who was the wife of a long-suffering prophet by the name of Hosea. Here's how I tell the story in my book, Less Than Perfect. She stands outside in the cool, refreshing rain, allowing it to run in rivulets across her cheeks and down her lips. She is like the lily of the valley that spreads its fragrance across the fields, or like the lush, abundant grapes that make men glad, fertility and fruitfulness, celebration and wild abandon. These are the forces that rise and surge within her. Young, beautiful, and bold, she is always smiling, flashing her big dark eyes, attracting inevitable attention. God knows how easy it would be to entice her admirers into showering her with gifts of silver and gold, though she is determined to squeeze every ounce of sweetness from life. That's not all she wants. More than anything, she is looking for someone she can adore. Suddenly, she notices a man hurrying toward her. It is not desire that propels him, but pain and hurt. She knows this because she is good at reading people, and because it is her husband who draws near. "Gomer," he says, "come home." And so she does, but reluctantly. Hosea is a good man, but goodness can be so tiresome. He talks only of God and of faithfulness to the covenant, dampening her high spirits and making her feel ashamed of her sins. But how can it be wrong to dream of having just a little pleasure in this life? Hosea is distressed by all he sees. The people offer sacrifices at pagan shrines, praising Baal for every harvest. They have forgotten the faith their fathers professed. But she thinks it matters little how people name their gods, whether Baal or Yahweh or Asherah, as long as they acknowledge God by paying homage for the rain and the harvest, the bread and the wine. If Yahweh is so upset, why has the rain been so abundant, the crops so lush, and the peace so prolonged? If everyone is worshiping the wrong God, why have so many people been blessed with so much? But Hosea insists on pointing out the twistedness in everything, the gap between rich and poor, all the deception and lies, the sleeping around, the killings, and the worship of countless idols. He says God's people have become no different than the surrounding peoples. Instead of whispering his disapproval, he shouts it as though he is God's chosen mouthpiece, telling everyone, especially the priests, that they are harlots and whores, and that God will surely punish them. She finds it infuriating and embarrassing to be known as the wife of the prophet Hosea, and her eyes begin to cast about for someone she can truly love. If Gomer would stop for just one moment and try to read her husband's heart, she would discover that she has broken it more than once. Perhaps she already knows this. But she doesn't know, not yet, how hard it was for Hosea to marry her when he did. She has no inkling that Yahweh, the God of his ancestors and hers, had instructed him, saying, "Go, marry a promiscuous wife and have children with her. Like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." Nor does she realize that her marriage has become a public parable, a story God is telling to his people. Now, I have to confess, I would rather compare myself to people like Ruth or David in his best years or Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, than to Gomer. But she too is part of my spiritual family tree, a woman whose story speaks to me about the foolishness of living life apart from God, as well as about the deep, long-suffering, passionate love of God, who is always trying to bring his people back to himself. In Gomer's day, one of the primary pagan deities was Baal. Since the Israelites depended on rain for a good harvest, the temptations of Baal worship, with its stress on the bringing of rain and fertility, proved too much for many people to resist. Many of her contemporaries combined Baal worship with the worship of Yahweh, no doubt considering themselves God's faithful followers, even though they were behaving like pagans. According to the law of the day, Hosea would have been within his rights to have had Gomer executed because of her unfaithfulness. But instead of punishing her or turning his back on her, he looks for her, rescues her from slavery, and welcomes her back into his arms when she is finally ready to come home. You know, this amazing story of a prophet who married a promiscuous woman displays the deep, self-sacrificing love of a God who calls us back from all the places we have wandered so that we can finally come home to him.